South Korea's presence is emerging within the nations of Southeast Asia, from investments across Vietnam to Singapore, Indonesia, and especially the Philippines. The archipelago nation of 100 million people in ASEAN has in recent years taken a huge amount, not only of investments, but also contractual works, business developments, infrastructure building, and even military initiatives. What has stood out specifically is the continuous help it has done across the nation's recent infrastructure craze, which saw close to $200 billion worth of investments to build and revolutionize the nation's transportation system. Information technology centers, educational universities, and hubs, to mega bridges, and even maritime-related activities such as seaports. But South Korea itself as a nation is not even just a huge part of the Philippines' economy. It is in fact growing and going deep within the country's culture, education, televised dramas, music, and most importantly its people. There are so many South Koreans today that call the nation of the Philippines their home. In fact, South Koreans have been among the largest tourist visitors to the Philippines over the past decades, declaring business activities that disrupted the entire nation's food industries, women's cosmetics, and fashion wear. They have also placed the Philippines as a way to enhance educational means. Why they chose the Philippines to study, rather than any other nation or elsewhere, could be a lot of things. But one thing is for sure, is that the geography availability and presumably the availability of English education is a huge factor. To further emphasize how South Korea's population has been so far, we could report that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs from South Korea estimated that as many as 150,000 people are living in the Philippines, making it one of the largest overseas South Korean homes in the world. Moreover, data from the tourism government of the Philippines also shows that the tourists visiting the Philippines from South Korea are from 2011 to 2020, the single largest visitors compared to all other nations around, more than China, the US, and Japan, registering a pre-COVID number of close to 2 million people. So how could South Korea and Philippines' relationship be so intertwined? Well, it goes way back to the 8th century, when early documentation found that Gungbok was a famous maritime figure from Korea, who was famous for dominating decades of maritime trade from then Korea known as Silla, then Japan known as Heian Japan, and then China known as Tang China. With such prominence, he had found himself arriving within the local islands of the Philippines. This, according to documentation, was probably the first time Koreans have found their way to the archipelago nation. But after Gungbok, little is known of any more documentation of Koreans in the Philippines in the centuries that follow. What has really been sophisticated and of large in history was truly the last 100 years from today's date. Saw the most significant individuals happening in the Second World War, when imperial troops from the Japanese army arrived with some Korean soldiers in the Philippines. And the 3 Korean soldiers that were brought along were from what is now today known as North Korea, had actually married local Filipino women. These individuals led to the creation of the Korean Association Philippines in 1969, which stands today as the largest Korean organization in the entire country. Soon after the war had ended, some Koreans and Japanese alike individuals who had come from the war had actually stayed in the Philippines and chose to build out their new life there. Although hate was at a high level among the Japanese, and presumably some Koreans who had fought alongside, as they were the ones who had wreaked havoc, these people had still continued living in the Philippines. By the 1950s, when the Korean War had emerged, the nation of the Philippines had sent out over 7,500 troops in favor of helping the south of Korea, which was at that time fighting for democracy against the emerging communist state of the north. Because of the newfound connections that were built over the Korean War, some Filipinos who had gone there had gone home with South Korean bridges at hand, which sparked the new beginning of the Koreans and Filipinos as a special relationship. But that is a part of history that has always been known. What has been so insignificant, however, is that as the war in Korea had also ended, not every Filipino chose to go back home. In fact, a lot of these Filipinos had stayed in South Korea and were documented as being fundamental in helping reconstruct the nation of South Korea. Filipino engineers were famous for building the Ministry of Culture office and the United States Embassy in Seoul. They had also introduced numerous technologies which came from the US, and even IBM Korea, a huge American conglomerate, had appointed a Filipino as its president in 1968. It is estimated that there are around 60 to 70,000 Filipinos living in South Korea. It is even known that the first ever non-ethnic Korean to stand as a member of the National Assembly of South Korea is a Filipina-born Jasmine Villanueva, later Jasmine Lee, as she found herself married to a South Korean man and ended up being a citizen of the nation itself. The coming 21st century and its following years, however, were the most significant in all of the two nations' history. Bilateral relationships were at high, annual trade was hitting records, foreign investment flows were seen very favorably, and South Korean companies were aggressively expanding their products and services to sell the local citizens of the Philippines. This has also sparked the great migration of South Koreans to the Philippines. The huge number of increases is recorded by the Bureau of Immigration Students. With a strong youth population entering, they had brought in their family with them and paved the way for the beginning of the so-called Korean Wave, which was a movement that brought Korean culture across the world. This has likewise also brought Korean entrepreneurs, who introduced further Korean items and services. As this was happening in the early 2000s, the Philippines had also emerged to become a known transit hub for North Korean defectors, whereas over 500 North Koreans would go through as a refugee. In other words, both North and South Koreans were entering the Philippines during the 21st century and were in large numbers. This has in essence helped build out the Philippines' most profound foreign investments during the 21st century, which is known as the Hanjin Subic Shipyard, located within the Subic Free Port Zone, which today may have already been defunct, but still stood as a miracle, as it had helped the Philippines become one of the largest shipbuilders across the world, and tens of thousands of jobs or even hundreds of thousands indirectly, as the Hanjin Subic Shipyard had been known to have revenue exceeding billions of dollars throughout its lifespan. Today, Koreans are everywhere in the nation, and as noted earlier, they have also been so big in the infrastructure developments of the nation. This is a topic we can't just avoid, as it may play a role in forming a stronger relationship between the two in the future. South Korea's government and private corporations have worked so well for the Philippines that it could be arguably said that some of the projects the Philippines has today would not have begun had it not been for South Korea's help. They were among the largest financiers, sources of technology, and supporters of the nation's so-called Build, Build, Build initiative. They had consistently tried to prove that whatever they had done back in their own country could also be done in the Philippines. This would mean whether that is through the strong development of the nation or even the advancement of one's economy. They're even preparing one of their biggest projects ever in the Philippines, which will see the construction of a smart city within the nation's Clark Freeport and Economic Zone, which will be linked to the Clark International Airport and serve as a way for the Philippines to take a step forward to the world of digital and the Fourth Industrial Revolution. It is without a doubt that the long history filled with cultural exchange, forming of individual relationships, and government interactions were key in making sure the two nations' history do play intact. This is why we think that South Korea has been at large within the nation's infrastructure. It's also crucial, as the Philippines is amongst the largest trading partners of South Korea, and will likely have a huge impact on its economy in the future, which might be of help if they do seem to improve the economy of the Philippines today. Either way, what do you think about South Korea and the Philippines' economic and historical relationship? Let us know down below.